Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the afternoon session. Well, as some people say, our society is undergoing a fundamental transformation. We're seeing the second machine age, the third industrial revolution, and we're heading towards an economy 4.0. And interestingly enough, it's in particular those people in the Silicon Valley who get most worried about the future of humanity, in particular the future of jobs. We don't know how the job situation will be in the future. Some people think about 50% of jobs will be gone, of today's jobs, in 10 to 20 years. And the question is, will we be able to come up with enough jobs within that time period? So if we look back in history, then we basically see that all these transformations from the agricultural society to the industrial society, I mean the economy 2.0, from the industrial society to the service society, the economy 3.0, that came with disruptions. That came with financial and economic crisis, and it came also with revolutions and wars, unfortunately. Now, we have seen already a financial and economic crisis. The question is, how can we avoid revolutions and wars in this transformation? And so really, we need to think hard about this challenge that we're faced with, and we need to learn how our society will transform or can be transformed, how to build a better society with the technology which is at hand, because the digital revolution is what is driving this transformation. Now, in particular also, we're living in a more and more networked world, and that brings us to the subject of complexity. And of course, one of the best known economists in that field is Alan Kirman. Alan started off at Dulwich College, then he worked at Oxford University, particularly Jesus College. He did graduate studies at the University of Minnesota, then at Princeton University. He was assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, professor at the Free University in Brussels, then later on at Warwick and in Marseille. So you can see that over here. And he's also associated to the European University Institute in Florence. So I don't want to steal more time. Thank you very much, Ellen, for being with us and sharing your insights.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. I came back to Engelberg after 45 years of absence. I came here as a young man to ski, and haven't been back since, but I'm very, very happy to be here. When Oscar Wilde once went to New York, and when he came back, somebody said, "Did you enjoy yourself?" And he said, "Well, there was nothing else to enjoy, was there?" And so, but that's not true of coming to Engelberg. I'm very happy to be here. And what I want to talk about is the following idea, which is quite simple, really, that we've had over a couple of centuries now the development of political and social liberalism, and it's come to dominate philosophy, particularly in the West. And economics has tried to go along with that in developing a science which would justify the ideas underlying liberalism. And I would say that the reason that we have got ourselves into a difficult position now is because we've insisted absolutely relentlessly on this idea that if you leave individuals to themselves, then the economy will somehow self-organize into a state which has satisfactory welfare properties. And I think that this claim is backed up neither by empirical evidence nor by theory, and it's become essentially an assumption. So what's the motivation for my talk? There's been a dissatisfaction on the part of a lot of policymakers, particularly recently, and some economists, with modern economic theory. And I think what we have to do is abandon the central tenet of economic theory, which is that economy will self-organize itself into a state which is optimal or efficient. And what's actually happening is that what we've ignored in our theory is the fact that people are constantly interacting with each other. And when you have a system like that, with individuals or particles or molecules or animals which are interacting with each other, what you see at the aggregate level will not be the same as what you see at the individual level. And I think that we have to understand those interactions, and we'll never understand aggregate behavior without that. And so you have to think of the economy as a complex, adaptive system. Complex because all these parts are interacting, and because the aggregate doesn't look like the individuals. And secondly, because the aggregate behavior really is quite different in its characteristics from what goes on at the individual level. You can't just project an individual. I take a representative agent like Dirk and say, if only I can work out how Dirk would behave in these circumstances, then I know how the economy would behave. That's not how it works. But unfortunately, what we have in those sort of systems is you can have sudden endogenous changes which happen, the system itself gets into trouble. And as soon as we allow for that, then that undermines this idea that, oh, leave the economy alone, leave the markets alone, and everything will be okay. And so I think what we should do, rather than focus our attention on the ideal individual who's optimizing on his own, we should, in fact, worry about the fact that the economy is composed of individuals who interact with each other. I want to start with a quick analogy, and this is a picture of the Western Antarctic ice sheet. And it's collapsing into the sea much faster than it did, and in part, we are responsible for that by the increased ozone hole and by carbon CO2 emissions. But why should economists be interested in that? First of all, because it's claimed that human behavior is in part responsible. And secondly, because I think once you're faced with that sort of problem, a well-trained economist would say, well, that's obvious. What's happening is CO2 has caused the atmosphere to warm, the sea is warmer, therefore the ice sheet is melting. In fact, the mechanism is more indirect. What actually has happened is that there have been stronger winds now as a result of global warming, and those strong winds are pushing warm water, which was there already, into the Antarctic region and causing the melting. So here's the important point, which is that there is no stabilizing mechanism intrinsic in this system. So it's not true that we could now reverse that. We can't reverse it. And secondly, we can change some things which may slow it down, but we have to face up to the fact that this sort of system can self-organize itself into an unstable state. And why should that be a lesson for economists? Because we too are faced with a complex adaptive system, and we have very limited control over it. Economists have always wanted to believe that we're going to get to a science where we would control everything, and we could just tell you, if we do that, that will happen. And that's simply, I think, at odds with what actually we do know. And sometimes we can't even reverse the consequences of measures we take. And the way in which the system self-organizes itself creates its own dynamics, its own incentives. And a wonderful book by Sam Bowles called Machiavelli's Mistake explains all of that, saying how we believe that the system will self-organize, but as soon as it starts to self-organize, people have incentives to do other things, things change in the system, and so forth. And what we have is a system in which crises are an intrinsic feature, and they're not an intrinsic feature of our models. So we have this discrepancy between our models, which don't have crises in them, and what actually happens out there. So we can't justify with our theory anything which says that this economy will self-organize itself. And this problem of fundamental instability has been taken up in many disciplines, like ecology. Ecologists used to believe, until the work of Bob May and other people, that if only you left nature on its own, it would be stable. And now we know that nature itself can go through huge crises, collapses of species and so forth, and that the system itself has intrinsic instabilities. Unfortunately, in economics, we haven't really bought into that. How do we get there? Well, of course, the original idea is Adam Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith, it's unfortunate for him because he spent very little time on the invisible hand, where individuals pursuing their own self-interests will lead the economy into a good situation. He spent a lot of time in the theory of moral sentiments explaining the complicated nature of this problem and that it wasn't really quite so simple. But there's been so much progress with the free trade argument, with general arguments for liberalism, that the whole movement, socially and philosophically, has been in that direction, and economics somehow had to go along. And indeed, up until 2008, people were becoming very confident in our theory. They thought it was becoming mathematically more sophisticated and was becoming more reliable. Bob Lucas, the president of the AEA, said in 2003, the central problem of depression prevention has been solved. So everybody was happy. And Ben Bernanke wrote articles about the great moderation, the reduction in the volatility of macroeconomic variables. So our models functioned pretty well during that period. But you could ask yourselves, or wouldn't almost any model have functioned well in that period? Because it was pretty stable, not much was going on. But what we need are models to help us understand, explain, and deal with crises, and not with these calm periods. So I would claim that our Achilles heel is in our theory, and we perpetrated this myth that if only you leave the economy alone, then it will self-organize into this efficient state. But even in our perfect theoretical world, we can't show that that will happen. And when you hear nowadays, people should do these reforms, they should make these appropriate changes to economy, what they want to get it back to is the perfect underlying economy that economists have in mind. But even there, we can't prove that an economy of that sort will in fact stabilize itself and get into equilibrium. And crises are usually considered to be exceptional events caused by something exogenous. They're not in the system. And yet what we know, and any historian will tell you this, is that they are indeed part of our system. We tend to explain them as saying, well, they're like black swans, very rare and sort of almost imaginary things. Actually, they're not imaginary because I took a photo of one in Adelaide. But the idea was that these are somehow events which happen every now and then, but they're really bad, but they'll pass and we'll get back to normal. So Alan Greenspan, for example, said, with notably rare exceptions, the global invisible hand has created relatively stable exchange rates, interest rates, prices, and wage rates. And somebody very nasty said, with notably rare exceptions, Germany remained largely at peace with its neighbors during the 20th century. And somebody even nastier said, with notably rare exceptions, Alan Greenspan has been right about everything. So, at the time of the crisis, 2008, The Economist, which is not the most progressive of journals, actually had on its front page this ice cream which was melting down, modern economic theory, where it went wrong and how the crisis is changing it. And unfortunately, I think, if you know our profession, not that much has changed. Somehow, many people said, let's just bed down and wait and it'll all pass. But in other disciplines, as I just mentioned to you, like ecology, things have changed. People don't think like that anymore. They think of the system as itself being vulnerable to these sort of changes and these sort of crises. And let me give you an example of how I think we got ourselves locked into this position. This is a quote from Mario Draghi, who's somebody for whom I have great respect. And what Mario Draghi said, he was comparing the euro to the bumblebee. He said, this is a mystery of nature, because it shouldn't fly, but instead it does. And what does he mean it shouldn't fly? He means we have models which show that it can't fly. And now I think people ask how come. There was something in the atmosphere in the air that made the bumblebee fly. Now something must have changed in the air. And we know what after the financial crisis. The bumblebee would have to graduate to a real bee. And that's what it's doing. But if you go out to the street in Engelberg and ask somebody, you know, what would you say? Is there something wrong with my model of the bumblebee, or is there something wrong with the bumblebee? And I think it's curious to suggest that the bumblebee should adapt rather than that we should change our model, which says that it can't fly. And a friend of mine drew this nice drawing where Mario Draghi is explaining to the bumblebee that, are you sure you want to keep on flying? You see? Because obviously we have models which say you can't fly. And I think our problem is we're so wedded to our models that when they don't actually correspond to anything you might see in the empirical reality, we wonder what the problem with the evidence is and not what the problem with our models. If we have models saying bumblebees cannot fly, then we should modify bumblebees and not our models. So, Trichet, the ex-governor of the European Central Bank, and to those who, of course, those who don't speak French don't know that tricher in French means to cheat. But he said at the time when the crisis hit, macro models failed to predict the crisis, seemed incapable of explaining what was happening to the economy in a convincing manner. As a policymaker during the crisis, we felt abandoned by conventional tools. Judgment and experience inevitably played a key role. Now, economists like to think of themselves as scientists, so it's somehow unfortunate when the people making policies say, well, actually, we just base our thing on judgment and experience and not on your models. And Adair Turner, the head of the Financial Services Authority in the UK, went much further. He said, I believe that bad, or rather oversimplistic and overconfident economics helped create the crisis. There was a dominant conventional wisdom that markets were always rational and self-equilibrating. And now what about economic crises? Well, as I said, standard macroeconomic models would tell you that there is no possibility of a crisis in the sense of the one that we're experiencing, internal to the system. Something from outside must have happened, like a technological shock or important and unexpected news. But we know that that's not the case. So what we should do is, rather than build more and more sophisticated models which work well in non-crisis situations, we should really be working on models of crises. So what we have to be able to reproduce is these sudden endogenous changes in the economy, the global economy, without having to attribute them to some of these exogenous shocks. And our models at the moment of rational individuals acting on their own don't allow us to do that. Second point, I think optimization at both the individual and collective level is illusory. People are trying to improve all the time, but the idea that we actually manage to optimize is an illusion. What we should be concerned with, I think, is not so much efficiency, which has become a sort of mantra amongst economists, but rather coordination. The main problem in economics is how activities get coordinated or fail to be coordinated, and not the problem efficiency. So let me just illustrate the point about efficiency. As you know, economists are always building mechanisms which will lead to an efficient outcome, and the classical method for achieving, for example, I have an object which I want to sell. So how would I sell that in the most efficient way? That is, find the person who needs it most and is prepared to spend the most. Well, I would hold an auction, right? And here, if this works, you will see a fireman who is obviously well-trained as an economist, because there's a huge building which is on fire, and he only has one trampoline to save people who jump. So he decides that the only thing to do is to auction off the right to jump into this trampoline. And if this works, you should see this.
50 pounds! 50! 17! 90! 90! 200 pounds! 200 pounds up there! Anyone else? Going, gone! 210!
So, you see, we developed these nice, efficient mechanisms, but a very small change can make things go horribly wrong. Okay, so there are two basic approaches to modeling in economics. The standard one says that people are rational individuals who always optimize what they're doing, and we should only make assumptions about them. And these individuals satisfy our axioms of rationality, not what you might think is reasonable. They optimize in isolation, and they understand the economy they function in. And the aggregate behavior of this economy is like a representative individual. Now, the alternative, and the one which I would propose, is that individuals follow simple rules, they adapt to their environment, They're not irrational, and they don't act against their own interests, but they don't optimize. They have limited and largely local information, and aggregate behavior emerges from the interaction amongst all these people. And in fact, Hayek once said, Hayek's not a person who politically I like very much, but he said, it's the whole question of the theory of how far we can explain complex phenomena when we do not really have the power of precise prediction. We don't know of any laws. Our whole knowledge is the knowledge of a pattern. Now that doesn't make him sit very well with most economists who believe that we are building models which will allow us to have laws. So where does the difficulty in economics come from? Well, as I said, the economy is a complex system. The individuals interact directly. The aggregate behavior is not like the individuals, and the gap between individual behavior and the aggregate is real. Now, Bob Shiller, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, went as far as to say that he didn't think that this image we have of the economy was appropriate. And he said, an economy is a remarkably complex structure. The analogy between the brain, the computer is familiar, but one can make the same analogy between the computer and the economy. It's a network of people who communicate with each other via electronic and other connections. And if we get a better understanding of the brain and the computer, that may well help us to better understand the economy. But that's a very different image than the standard image of the economy. So I want to use now some lessons from individuals who do not have all the computing capacity that we attribute to them in economic models, but rather have very limited and local knowledge. And let me start with ants. So ants learn in an environment where they have very limited, very local knowledge, and yet, in aggregate, they produce quite sophisticated structures and behavior. So let me show you this little thing here. What we have is the ants are going to come out from that side, and they have to get to the food on the other side. Now, there are two trails of equal length. So you would say to yourself, how will they split up over the long run? Well, you can look at this and see what happens. And we ran a little simulation. And you say, well, they're going to split up half and half, right? The paths are equal length. What you observe, however, is that gradually, and this is just a little simulation, gradually the ants all concentrate on one path. So what's happening there is that there's what's called a positive feedback. Because the ants lay down a trail, ants who've gone down one path attract other ants. And so you get this cumulative move all to one side. Let me show you another example. Here you have a long path and a short path. And now we let them run again. And once again, this time, they seem to all go down the short path. And people say, but that's because of millions of years of adaptation, ants have learned to choose the short path. But that's just a simulation. Here is an experiment which is run by Guy Terrolas in Toulouse. Exactly the thing you just saw, long path, short path. And so this was on a German television program about optimal adaptation, about plants, animals, and so forth. And here, with some luck again, you will see what happens. Here they go.
Zunächst sieht es nach einem chaotischen Durcheinander aus. Aber schon nach wenigen Minuten geschieht etwas Erstaunliches. Die Kolonie entscheidet sich kollektiv für den kürzeren der beiden Wege. Möglich wird das durch ein spezielles Informationssystem.
So you see what happened. They went down the short path, and so people say there's a wonderful example of an optimal adaptation to their environment. The truth is that when the German television company arrived, Guy set up the experiment, and all the ants went down the long path. So the Germans said, unmöglich, we can't possibly put this in our program. Our program's about optimal adaptation. So Guy was very apologetic, and he ran the experiment again, and they all went down the long path. So the guy said, no, sorry, we have to go home. So they're packing up their stuff to go back to Berlin, and Guy felt very bad, so he ran the experiment a third time, and they went down the short path. And that's all you see in the film, of course. You don't know that they went. And of course, the point, once again, is just like humans and economies. It's not an optimal adaptation. It's, in general, they get there, and most often they will go down the short path. Sometimes they will go down the long path. You lose a bit, but that doesn't break the whole system down. A second observation, which we might learn from our little insect friends, is the role of thresholds. Now, you may or may not know that bees have to keep the temperature of their hives constant. How do they do that? They do that by fanning air through the hive. So what happens when the temperature rises? Well, if you were a good macroeconomist, you'd say, well, I take the representative bee and I watch him. So when the temperature rises, he must beat his wings faster and faster, right? And that's not what happens. What actually happens is that bees have different thresholds. Each bee is on or off. They always beat their wings at the same speed, but some bees turn their wings on, as it were, at a lower or a higher temperature. And that's how they produce this beautiful smooth reaction to the outside environment. So it's not that the individuals are nice and smooth, they're kind of just on or off, very simple. But collectively, they produce an interesting reaction. Second thing, are they optimizing? Well, I think when you see them here actually doing this job, they're getting it done. I mean, the air is going through the hive, but you see some of these guys just seem to get in the way. Look at him. I mean, that's not optimal. Well, we don't want to see. So the point is that, once again, these people are getting the job done. Collectively, they're extremely simple. And in aggregate, they have a very sophisticated reaction to the environment. But they're not doing this in an optimal way. They're sort of getting in the way and they're messing each other around. But somehow, they get the job done. So individuals with very simple rules produce very smooth aggregate behavior. Now I want to move on. You say, well, what sort of lesson is that for economics? And I want to move on to financial economics, which is where people tend to think that we're much more sophisticated than we are in ordinary economics. And I want to give you an example and then use my ants to explain a little bit of what's going on. So when you look at a financial market, they have usually the same basic building blocks. You have a set of individuals who forecast the future prices. Once they forecast the future prices, that determines how much they want to buy or sell. And that again will determine the price now at this period. And as a result of that price, seeing that price, individuals will change their forecasts, and so the system goes on. But does this process actually lead equilibrium prices to reflect the true value of the underlying assets? And the usual hypothesis that's used is the efficient markets hypothesis, which says all the relevant information about any assets is contained in prices. You don't have any need to look anywhere else. And that basic argument comes from the work of Bachelier, who did his thesis in 1900. But the referee for his thesis said, I think what you're doing is wrong. He said, and it was Henri Poincaré, the famous mathematician, he said, when people interact with each other, they don't do so by acting independently on their own information. They have this tendency to watch each other and to behave like sheep. And so Henri Poincaré saw the underlying weakness in our financial models already in 1900 and wrote this in a book in 1908. Many people, Poincaré, Keynes, Mandelbrot, and others, pointed this out, and yet our modern theory is still based on that underlying hypothesis that people are observing individually and independently their information and acting upon it, and it's in that way that it gets out into the public view. But the efficient markets hypothesis, Paul Krugman once cited Mencken in that regard. He said, there's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. And here you see these people who are supposed to be acting in isolation, solving their own complicated maximization problem, obviously uninfluenced by the guys around them. And where did the hypothesis go wrong? Well, as I said, individuals don't only look at their information, they look at others and they infer about other people's behavior information. So look at these people. They stood in Times Square and looked up at the sky. And after a while, there were about 5,000 people looking up at the sky. Why was that? Well, because if all these people are looking up at the sky, there must be something to see up there, right? So they inferred from these people's behavior that there was something to see up there. And so you have all these people looking up at the sky when there's nothing to look at. And this translates into financial markets. And here you see, on the left, this guy says, I've got a stock here that could really excel, sell, and they all go mad and sell. And down at the bottom here, you have a person who says, this is madness, I can't take it anymore, goodbye. Goodbye, bye, and off they all go again. And down here, you've got this person who says, I've got a stock here, and off we go again. But the point is, a small bit of information and this sort of herding behavior can lead a market way away from anything like a stable equilibrium price. So what we have to explain is these sudden large movements without apparently the arrival of any exogenous shock or piece of news. And that's the sort of movement that you just saw in that previous cartoon. But for example, look at this. This is the DAX Stock Exchange Index up until 2000. Well, you could say, well, that sort of corresponds to Bachelet's idea. It was a sort of random walk around a trend. So that was pretty much how it should be. Unfortunately, you have that. And then, of course, you have to say to yourself, well, what caused that? What caused that sudden downturn in 2000? Of course, the answer in an economic model would be there's some important news that suddenly happened at that point. And there's some exogenous shock. But the alternative, and what I would suggest, is you find a simple model of interacting agents which actually generates that sort of shift. And as Willem Buiter said, rather than constantly looking at exogenous shocks, he said, those of us who worry about endogenous uncertainty arising from the interactions of boundedly rational market participants cannot but scratch our heads at the insistence of the mainline models that all uncertainty is exogenous and additive. So let's come back to the ants and remember that the ants had to choose a food source to go to, or a path to go to the food source. And what they do is they recruit each other once they found it. And that's what's referred to as a positive feedback. And we can use that idea to model financial markets. So think of two sorts of people. They're fundamentalists who believe prices will come back to some fundamental level. Then there are chartists. Chartists are people who say, let me just look at past prices and try and anticipate what the next price will be. And what happens is that when one rule is successful, other people tend to adopt it. So like the ants, they all herd on to one opinion or the other. Inevitably, at some point, the thing switches back again. So what you have is people who are not irrational, they have short horizons, they're trying to do their best for the next period. And with Hans Vollmer and Ulrich Horst, two German mathematicians, we built models of that sort. And they capture this idea that people follow the behavior of other people, particularly when the behavior is successful. And those models capture the sort of contagion effects that we see in markets. But they give you a very different idea of equilibrium than the standard idea. The standard idea is prices will converge to the fundamental values. Here, they don't converge. They're always moving. In the long run, you can say something about the probability they will be in a certain area, but you can never say what the price will be tomorrow. And when you look at the distribution of stock markets, the influence of the chartists means that the tails of this distribution, the more extreme prices that you see, will be much more frequent than they would be if people were just on their own independently. And you can see here, these you have on the left the prices, and on the right the number of the fraction of chartists. When there are a lot of chartists around who are just extrapolating, you get a bubble. Second simple example. Dirk, how much time do I have?
5 minutes max.
5? Okay, sprint. Here we go. So what we want to do is to try and capture some of these things in our simple models. And I want to show you a very simple model of derivatives, which everybody here, of course, knows about. And although they were vaunted as being a way of spreading risk amongst the people holding these assets, in fact, they diminished the information that was available. You remember, derivative, you take a whole lot of assets, you bundle them up, and you cut it into pieces, and you sell the pieces to people, and those are derivatives. What do I mean by that? Well, in 2002 already, Warren Buffett was saying, derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction, carrying dangers that, while now latent, are potentially lethal. And what did he mean by that? What he meant was that, unfortunately, once you start to bundle these things up, people don't look much at the underlying assets. They just start to buy the derivative and not worry anymore about the quality of the underlying assets. Now, as you may remember, a lot of the blame is attributed to mortgage-backed securities. Now, shouldn't we have been aware that there was a problem? Because already by 2006, if you look at the house prices in different places in the US, they were peaking before the crisis happened. So that must mean that the housing market was more shaky than it was before. Because when you renege on your mortgage, basically in many states, the bank just gets the mortgage back, gets the an asset back, the house back, and that's it. So if prices are dropping, these are not good assets to hold anymore. And here's some historical motivation. The amount of these derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, increased enormously. But the thing you should look at is this thing here. If we issued mortgages in 2003, it took 5 years before 15% of them became delinquent. If you issued one in 2007, in 10 years, we were already nearly up to 25% of them had gone delinquent. And yet that information was known. So people should have been started to worry about these mortgage-backed securities. And what actually happened is that what we know is that for a long time, if you look at this last time, what happened with these mortgage-backed securities is that they were perfectly stable, and then the price collapsed. They collapsed in the order in which they were ranked by the rating agencies. So the best-rated ones collapsed last, the worst-rated ones collapsed first, but it was a sudden collapse. It wasn't a general decline as you might have expected. And what we did in our simple model was to say, well, what people have to do when they buy these things is to decide, do I check on the underlying assets, or do I simply buy it and sell it on to somebody else because he won't check either? And what you can show very simply is that there are two sorts of equilibrium. One in which nobody is checking. Everybody's selling this stuff on to everybody else. And the other in which everybody's checking and everybody realizes where the toxic assets are. And you see the two things there. And what happens is that the second equilibrium happens with a small increase in the risk underneath, and suddenly the whole thing collapses. And when we ran that model with people learning, what actually happened was that for a while, nobody was checking. Then some people started to check, and the whole thing just collapsed. And that's exactly what we observed. But once again, this was not based on some fundamentals. This was based on looking at other people, wondering, are they going to check or not? If they're not going to check, I'd better not buy, and so forth. Oh, so my last two topics, which will take about 2 minutes, Dirk, if you give me 2 minutes, are the other problems in our society. And one of them is inequality. And that's something which in our standard models also is not dealt with. In macroeconomic models, you say very little about the distribution of income. And yet that's become a key feature of recent economic disquiet. And this book attracted an enormous amount of attention, Thomas Piketty's book on capital, particularly in the United States. And why did it resonate so much? And why did all these people get out? And these people, you remember, nous sommes les 99% occupy France, and so forth. So suddenly people started to think, well, income distribution has just become too unequal for us to accept. But here is a very important fact, an inquiry which was run by Dan Ariely in the United States. And if people had only known what the truth was, they would have been out in the streets much more. 5,000 people were asked about wealth distribution in the US. And this is what people think that it is. They think that the top percent has round about 60% of the income, and next percent, 20 and so forth. But that's what they think that it is. Now, what do they think it should be? That's what they think it should be like. Well, maybe the top 20% should have 30%, because after all, they work harder and so forth. But the real question is, what is it really like? And that's what it's really like. Over 80% goes to the top 20%. So people, even though this is a huge subject of discussion and conversation, simply are unaware of the true extent of the inequality in our society. And so people are far from having understood that. And you can see that what they believe about the income distribution is as far from the actual situation as is their ideal. So given that people are in that situation, you can say to yourself, even that subject, which has been so much talked about, what is really important is people's perceptions of what's going on. And that hasn't been changed enough. So if people know so little about the current situation, then the question is, you know, in our models we believe that they understand perfectly how the whole economy works. And yet in reality, people understand very little. Last remark, markets and incentives. So we're told that markets will do the job, they will stabilize the whole situation. Most people remember the paradox of the blood donation. This is what in England was called the Cobra Effect. When the British had the Indian Empire, they thought that cobras were very dangerous and poisonous serpents who had a tendency to kill young and old people. Therefore, they said, we have to get rid of cobras. So the British, being intelligent people, said, we put a price on that, and what we would do is, if you come in with a dead cobra, we'll give you a sum of money. What was the result of that policy? Almost every Indian started to raise cobras, and then they'd kill them off and take them in for the price. So the incentive was not quite right. When the one state in the US couldn't collect enough blood by donations, they said, well, we're going to pay for these for people giving blood. And the amount of blood given went down. Why was that? Because people didn't want to be seen to be paid for giving blood. They gave blood for other reasons. So the incentive again was wrong. And the last story is the Haifa creche, where fathers brought their kids back to the creche too late. So the creche said, we are imposing a fine. Immediately, the fathers brought their children later, picked up their kids later. Why was that? Because now there was a price on it. You know, that was a price you had to pay for being late. And so that was acceptable. So it was no longer a moral problem, it just became a price. And I would claim that the recent scandals in the banking industry reflect a little bit that. So we had these huge fines on banks, but as the Citigroup CEO said at one point, well, he said, we factor that in. So in other words, when you're faced with these huge fines, we now calculate what we might have to pay and decide whether it was worth it or not. And if you look at those fines, that was just for the foreign exchange scandal, but look at the LIBOR fines and so forth. There is this notion that I think we may have got it wrong by not relying on people's somehow good intentions or not perhaps punishing individuals. But once you say, these are the fines, then people say, well, should we pay the fine or not? Like parking. You know, if the parking fine's too small, you may park illegally and not worry about it. Okay, so what I would claim is that in these systems, individuals, whatever rules you have in place, will adapt to them. And some people will behave badly, and history is redolent with examples of things that have been put in place to try and control systems. I read in one of the introductory statements to this conference that we're overdoing regulation, we're somehow crushing the markets. That implies that people will behave properly if you don't have all those regulations. Those regulations have come there for something. And our real problem is the underlying behavior of individuals and of banks as well. And it's that somehow the whole system organizes itself in such a way that somehow people start to feel that they can push things a bit further. And it's very difficult to control systems like that. So the faith that one would have by dropping all these rules in people's behavior doesn't seem to be justified. Overall conclusions. Contrary to what is said in standard macroeconomic models, aggregate behavior in the economy is not like individual behavior. And it's the organization of these interacting individuals with all the associated feedbacks which produces this aggregate structure which is so difficult to understand. Economies are basically not in equilibrium. They're constantly evolving and spontaneously generate periodic crises. They're complex adaptive systems which coordinate on outcomes which can be far from optimal. And such systems are much less predictable than our current economics claim. We are far from being a science in the physical sense, and I don't think we will ever get there. For those of you who may want to know a bit more, you might want to read this book, which I published in 2010. That's not me, that's Schumpeter. But, Schumpeter, when he died, said, I had 3 wishes in life: to be the best economist, to be the best lover, and to be the best horseman. And somebody, one of his friends, said he achieved 2 of them, but we don't know which 2. Okay, how long will it take before that alternative view takes over? Max Planck said, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that's familiar with it. Now, many people after this sort of talk say, but you're telling us we should give up all our economic models and we should just not try and model and analyze the system. And that's quite the opposite of what I say. What I am saying is we should adapt new approaches to modeling the economy, which incorporate all these features of crises and bubbles and so forth, and worry about questions like inequality and so forth. And as Buzz Brock once said, I do believe you should keep an open mind, and as he said, you want to keep an open mind, but you don't want to open it so far that your brain falls out. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alan, for this thought-provoking talk. I see already some hands up there, so maybe we start right in the second row with a question or comment, and then go backwards.
I'm very impressed by your presentation. Now, my question, what will be the intrinsic reaction of the global economic system to the situation described in Thomas Piketty's remarkable publication? What will be the intrinsic reaction to the maldistribution of income and wealth?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think underlying a lot of the sort of events that we've seen, for example, in Spain and in other countries, Podemos, these other movements, they are a result of people starting to perceive this huge amount of inequality. And I think, and many people have warned us in the past, of course, that this sort of inequality will at some point lead to civil unrest, that people, not only civil unrest within a country, but also between countries. You know, when you have countries that are so different in their per capita income, this leads, first of all, to movements. And so migration and so forth is not only migration because of war, it's also migration simply because people will tend to move to places where they're likely to be better off. So the huge amount of inequality is not only within a country, it's also across countries. And all of that will lead to, I think, a huge amount of adjustment. And we will have to be very careful about how we actually handle that. But I don't think, incidentally, we had a conversation at lunch, I don't think the solution to that will be simply to say, well, we're just going to have to stop the people at the bottom end from moving or from doing anything. The solution will have to be that we have to learn how to somehow settle with that situation and adapt to it and help the people at the bottom. I think we simply, at the moment, don't transfer enough to people.
The remedy is education.
Education, of course. Yeah, but then, you know, one thing we can do is actually finance the education, put much more money into it. But we're constantly being told, no, public expenditure has to be cut. You know, you must get rid of this expenditure. But that's the sort of expenditure we should be investing in, because that's an investment, not a cost.
So, thank you very much, Alan. I got an indication that I have to stop this discussion session. Very unfortunately, I'm sure we could go on for hours. And fortunately, there are 3 days of this workshop, so there will be plenty of opportunities to talk to Alan and to have really stimulating discussions. Thank you very much again. We have to move on.